when no one is accountable, no one is safe. And it's time for the people of Texas to very seriously rebut the propaganda of the wrongdoers, the defrauders, the harm producers, whether they be insurance companies, manufacturers, or distributors, to rebut that propaganda and make their lawmakers in Austin pay attention to their desperate needs for justice when, in their innocence, they are wrongfully injured or rendered sick. This rollback has to be spearheaded by the health care lobby in this country, by people who defend children's safety, by trade unions, but above all, by the trial bar, by the plaintiffs' lawyers. I have been praising the plaintiff lawyers in Texas for years because of how they built these protections for ordinary people who, through no fault of their own, have been injured and sickened by recklessness, negligence, or outright criminal behavior. But the time has come to hold the plaintiff lawyers more accountable for saving, restoring the common law system of liability that they spent so much of their time and skill in the past to enlarge. Common law liability has now been destroyed by insurance industry lobbied statutory restrictions. Now, we don't have here a number of wrongfully injured Texans, but you won't have to go far to find those who have been seriously injured by medical negligence and medical malpractice, or by toxic chemicals, or by defective vehicles and other products. And I urge you to do so, to put the tragic human face on this situation of closing the courts in Texas to the most vulnerable and the most entitled to justice and accountability. Last point I want to make before we can have questions, and by the way, more Texans are killed by medical negligence than are killed on the highways in Texas. That's true all over the country. The growing opposition to the Trans-Texas Corridor is very encouraging. Trans-Texas Corridor was born in too much secrecy. Its motivation was not made clear. And the Texas Department of Transportation is now increasingly besieged by outraged farmers, ranchers, mayors, are increasingly organized to stop it. My prediction is it will not be built. You can carve highways through Texas on paper, but once the eminent domain kicks in, once towns and ranches and farms are divided and carved up, once the evidence as to how unnecessary that Trans-Texas Corridor is, the Texas citizens will be rebelling. And you can see it month by month grow in intensity and organizational skill. Again, my prediction, the Trans-Texas Corridor is finished. All that's left is to repeal NAFTA by withdrawing from it and renegotiating it so that it becomes a pull-up trade agreement, a non-secret process trade agreement, rather than a pull-down trade agreement on workers, consumers, and the environment. Do we have any questions, please?
Yes, I have a question for you, sir. It seems interesting to me that you come to Texas in the middle of a national presidential campaign and focus your remarks on a domestic Texas issue while admitting at the same time you're not going to be on the Texas ballot. What's the reason?
First, we'll be on the write-in ballot. Second, I always campaign in 50 states. That's the way to respect all the voters. Third, I want to come to Texas to highlight the ballot access restrictions and the need to roll them back so that voters have more of a choice of candidates, and not just Democrat, Republican. And fourth, we always take stands on local issues that represent subject matter that we've worked on over the years. Unlike other major presidential candidates who don't want to touch a local issue, they want to stay in the area of stratospheric generalization and rhetoric. We get down with local people who are struggling for justice in their lives.
Is one or the other of the major political parties in this country more in tune with the kinds of things you champion, specifically in this case, civil justice?
Yeah, obviously I can give you examples from the Democrats and the Republicans, but they both flunk. That's the standard. The standard is they both have surrendered their independence and integrity to corporate power and corporate money and let our federal government be hijacked by these multinational corporations. That's the marker. I mean, I can tell you on certain, on Medicare, for example, the Democrats are better than the Republicans. I can tell you that John McCain has been more willing to criticize wasteful defense contracts than Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. But overall, these two parties have allowed the corporatization of our government and the subordination of the sovereignty of the people to the greed and power of giant corporations.
Let me just add, certainly on the war in Iraq, I think the ascension of the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, to that post, I would remind you that the Democrats told us that if she became the Speaker, they would end the war in Iraq. And what we saw when she became the Speaker was actually $50 billion more dollars put towards that war. And this year, of course, it went even higher. And so, when people often say, which party is better, well, who's got the better rhetoric or who has the better action? And I think on the better action, neither party is worth believing in at this point. Neither of those parties.
What sorts of changes would you like to see to ballot access here in Texas?
I would like to see it reduced to about 5,000 signatures with at least 4 months to gather them. In Tennessee, for example, only 300 signatures are required. There's a great variation, but Texas, Oklahoma are among the worst. Oklahoma doesn't even count write-in votes. That's considered illegal in Oklahoma. So I think 5,000 is a good threshold for determining whether a candidacy is serious. Instead, by the way, it's 75,000.
Ralph, why don't you mention the fact that the time period to gather signatures if you're not in a political party is shorter than if you are in a political party?
Yes.
I mean, that on its face doesn't make any sense, and I think it's violative of equal protection and due process.
Well, eventually a court will overturn it. We just won the Ninth Circuit decision invalidating an Arizona law that said you can't petition for a presidential candidate in Arizona unless you're a resident there. I mean, this is one country, after all. They should be able to call in their friends from New Mexico and Texas. So we're starting slowly to turn it around. The Pennsylvania Attorney General has just returned indictments, criminal indictments against 12 Democrats in the legislature, 2 legislators and the rest legislative aides for using in 2004 government money, government resources, taxpayer dollars to get the Nader line off the ballot. And they're going to jail. So the only way you can begin changing these restrictive laws, which also, of course, deny voters their choices of candidates, is to get inside the electoral arena and battle it out. That gives you legal standing to sue, and it provokes the corruption, so it has to surface and retaliate as it did in Pennsylvania, and now they've got caught by the criminal laws.